Well, we're glad that you're here. If you have your Bible or your phone, I want you to go to John chapter 20. While you're turning there, I also want to invite you back next weekend, next Sunday. We're kicking off a brand new series that we're calling Next. And the idea behind it is almost every single person at some point in your life has questions about what comes next. What happens after this life comes to an end? And the truth is, most of us have questions. Most of us have way more questions than we have answers. So a few months ago, I asked some people, what kind of questions do you have about the afterlife? And they turned in some really good ones. For example, what will I look like in heaven? Will I be able to see my loved ones? Will my memories be wiped clean? What happens before we get there? What about the judgment day? And then my favorite, will I finally be skinny in heaven? And my answer is, I hope so. Those are all good questions, and next weekend we're going to start to look at what the Bible actually teaches about that, so I hope that you'll join us. As we start today, I want to show you a couple pictures actually that you may have seen on the news this past week. These are pictures that were taken this past Monday as the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, France burned this past Monday evening. Now, if you're unfamiliar with it, the construction started in the year 1163 and wasn't completed until 182 years later in the year 1345. I was talking to our building team Monday night. The last 2 years have felt like 2 decades around here, but can you imagine a building project that went for 182 years? You would have had entire generations of people who worked on this with no hope of ever seeing it completed. Now, if you saw any of the TV coverage, somewhere around 6:50 p.m. Paris time, the roof caught on fire, the main part of the complex. 2 hours later, the entire roof was gone. There was a surreal moment when what they called the spire, what we would call the steeple, crashed into the main body of the building because of the intensity of the flames. Now, Notre Dame Cathedral averages anywhere from 12 to 13 million visitors on an annual basis, and Monday was no exception. As the TV cameras tried to capture the images of the building as it burned, they also included images of thousands of people who had flooded the streets in and around the cathedral to watch it burn. Some of them were crying. Many of them were trying to record it with their phones. You may have seen there was one group that got together and started singing songs in a circle as they watched this historic building go up in flames. At some point during the evening, there were members of the media that went into the crowd. They started to interview different people who were watching this, different onlookers. There was one lady, a 29-year-old woman who lives near the cathedral, that said something that caught my attention. She said this to a reporter from USA Today. Her name is Anastasia Collis. Here's what she told the reporter. She said, "I don't have the words for this. I want to cry. I don't know if we're going to lose it entirely, but this is devastating, but I'm going to stay here until it ends." A few minutes later, they interviewed a person in another crowd. Here's what he said. He said, "It feels like hell itself is opening up under our feet." Now, if you were to take what those onlookers were feeling and multiply it somewhere around 1 million times, you'd come close to what those early followers of Jesus were feeling on that Sunday morning of that first Easter weekend. For them, it felt like everything they'd invested their lives in was going up in flames, and this kingdom that they thought they were building, this movement that they thought they were building, had now been reduced to a pile of ashes. As far as they knew, Jesus was dead, the future looked dark, and they were in grave danger. For them, they had stayed until the end, and now it felt like hell itself had opened its feet underneath them. In their minds, this was the end of the road. Now they had to figure out what to do next. But if you keep reading, you realize that what seems like the conclusion to the story is anything but. Over the last few weeks, there's been one verse that we've returned to several times. It's from 1 Corinthians. And here's the way a guy named Paul tells the story. He said, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. Now, here's why this verse is so important. He mentions 3 things: the death, the burial, and the resurrection. But here's the reason this stands out to us. One of the things that was true in the first century and continues to be true even up until the year 2019 is that once people are dead, And once people are buried, they don't make any more appearances. I mean, you might have a picture of them. You might be able to close your eyes and visualize them standing there in front of you. But we all know that's different. Once people are dead and once they're buried, they don't go around making appearances to anybody. That's just something that's always been true until one particular Sunday morning when it wasn't true. And just so we're clear, the disciples understood that too. In their minds, it was game over. They'd been a part of some cool things. They had some interesting stories they could tell for the rest of their lives, but they had watched Jesus die. In their minds, that was the end of the story, and now it was time to move on and figure out what was next. But then as Saturday night rolled into Sunday morning, everything looked different. If you have your Bible, open to John chapter 20. We're going to look at how the Apostle John describes the events of that Sunday morning. If you look in the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke tend to put the focus on the place and the timeline of events. John puts the focus on how the resurrection personally impacted several different people. One of those people he mentions is a lady named Mary. We know her as Mary Magdalene. Just a few days ago, there was a movie released about her life. You may have seen the previews. It stars Rooney Mara and Joaquin Phoenix. Now, I haven't seen the movie yet, but that goes to show you that there's something about her story that even Hollywood finds compelling. Truth is, we don't really know much about Mary. What we do know is more speculation than history. Two things we know for sure. Her name was Mary. She was from a little fishing village called Magdala, which is why she's known as Mary Magdalene. And years earlier, near the beginning of Jesus' 3-year ministry, Mary found herself in a very dangerous and tough situation. She encounters Jesus, and Jesus heals her from something called demon possession. Here's the way Luke tells this in Luke chapter 8. It says, after this, Jesus traveled from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases, one of which was Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Now, it's hard for us to imagine what your life would be like if you were controlled by 7 demons. We don't know much about demon possession, but every picture you get in the New Testament is that it was a horrible existence. Physical pain, mental anguish, isolation, abandonment. I mean, it was a horrible deal. And then she encounters Jesus, and in one moment, Jesus heals her, and life looks dramatically different. And from that point on, Mary was a part of this little group of women who followed Jesus everywhere that he went. Some of those women were very prominent because the New Testament tells us that they provided for Jesus' physical needs. So I bring all that up to say this. As Saturday night turned into Sunday morning, Mary felt like her life was over too. This little group of women, it wasn't just the guys that were hurting, it was this little group. They'd lost their protector, they'd lost their leader, and now Mary had lost the one person who had given her life back. And now she's in a situation where she doesn't know where to turn. And for her, it feels like all of her life, this life she was building, has been reduced to a pile of ashes. And the picture you get as Saturday turns into Sunday is that for Mary and this small group of people, the events of the previous 48 hours have moved so quickly, they haven't had time to process everything. So they get up early as soon as the Sabbath was over on Sunday morning, and they head out to visit Jesus' tomb to say goodbye to somebody that they deeply loved. Check out the way John tells this story. John chapter 20, verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." Now, I want you to imagine that somebody that you love deeply has just passed away. The funeral was 2 days prior. You wake up 2 days later and you decide, I'm going to visit the tomb. There's some things that I just want to spend some time near them. So you get in your car, you drive to the cemetery, you park your car, you begin walking to the burial plot, and the closer you get, the more you can tell that somebody's been messing with the grave. From a distance, it looks as if the gravestone has been knocked over. The flowers that were so neatly arranged when you left are strung out everywhere. And the closer you get, you're horrified to see that somebody not only has done all that, they've taken a shovel, they've taken a backhoe, and they've dug up the hole where your friend or your loved one was buried, and they've stolen the casket. Now imagine what you would feel in that moment. That's what Mary and this little group of women were feeling when they arrived at the tomb of Jesus on that Sunday. Make sure to say, they didn't go there because they expected the tomb to be empty. They were going there to say goodbye. They were going there to have a private memorial service. So when they arrive and they see that this entrance to the tomb has been rolled away, they immediately think the worst. And it says that Mary runs back to town where she gets Peter and John and the other disciples, and she tells them what's happened. Check out verse 3. So Peter and the other disciples started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Now that's John's way of inserting a little trash talk in the Easter story. Verse 5, he bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. Verse 9. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. One thing's interesting. You read through this story, there's 4 different versions of this story in the Gospels, and everybody reacts differently. Nobody's quite sure what to think. Even verse 9, John says, hey, even after 3 years of hearing about this, we didn't understand it. Like Jesus told them about the resurrection, and it just went right over their heads. And the reason they didn't understand it is because of something that you know is true that makes it hard for us to believe it. And it's this: nobody expects a dead person to come back to life. We know that doesn't happen. The disciples didn't expect it either. So what do? How do you make sense of this? Mary Magdalene had the same questions. You go through this story, there are 4 things. If you have your bulletin or your app, there's 4 blank lines on the outline today. It might help you think through this with me. 4 steps to making sense of this. And here's the first one. If you're keeping track, on that first blank line, just write the word examine. One of the things that we see throughout this story is that even though Mary's heartbroken, she's willing to examine the evidence that's in front of her. Verse 10, John tells us that once they saw the empty tomb, he and Peter go back to the other guys. They want to talk about this. They want to process this. But then in verse 11, Mary does something that took untold amount of courage. She goes back to the tomb for a second trip. Check out verse 11. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw 2 angels in white seated where Jesus had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They've taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they've put him." Now you think about this. Why, after everything she's been through, after all the emotional trauma, would Mary Magdalene risk going back to Jesus' tomb for a second time? And the answer is, she's got some questions. And she knows the only place she's going to find those answers if she continues to look at the evidence. Now, you know, there's a lot of people in our culture, a lot of powerful people with loud voices who tell us that the story of the resurrection of Jesus is just that. It's just a story. It's kind of like any other fairy tale you may have heard when you were a kid. It's meant to appeal to weak-minded and superstitious people. Richard Dawkins was a famous proponent of that view. He was a professor at the University of Oxford, also a well-known critic of all things religious. He was on TV constantly. And in one of his later interviews, right before his death last year, he made this statement. He said, "Presumably, what happened to Jesus was what happens to all of us when we die. We decompose." Then he said this: "Accounts of Jesus' resurrection and ascension are about as well documented as Jack and the Beanstalk." And you hear that, and the question is he right? Is it true that there's no evidence to support any of this? And I think the answer to that is no. In fact, I think the more you start to examine the story, the more you have to admit that something happened. For example, how do you explain the empty tomb? Or what about Jesus' body? Why is it that even the enemies of Jesus, who had every reason to try and shut down this story, never produced his body? Or what about the disciples? Here's this little group, fearful, scared, average guys. And from this point on, they travel all over the world and tell their versions of this story. What was it that inspired them? It's been well documented. All of the disciples, except for John, were either crucified or executed in incredibly brutal ways because they dared to believe that Jesus really did come back from the dead. And why would they do that if there was nothing to it? This was the moment that launched the movement. And you put yourself in the disciples' shoes on that Sunday morning. They weren't expecting this. They came up with every alternative theory they could because everything in them told them that what they were seeing couldn't possibly be real. And yet over time, they became convinced, even to the point of dying for it. And you go back through history, you're going to find thousands of examples of people who've done the same thing. They continued to read the story, people much smarter than me. I want to show you a picture. This is Dr. Rosalind Picard. She's a professor at MIT. Now, in her professional life, she's considered the founder of something called affective computing. It's a branch of the field known as artificial intelligence. And what she's done is she's developed a way for computers to read human emotions and based on that to change the way they interact with people to help people feel better. Now, I know that sounds like something, like out of the Twilight Zone or, a science fiction movie, but it's a real thing. You'll sometimes see it referred to as artificial emotional intelligence. She speaks all over the world. She recently gave a TED Talk, very popular. You might want to check it out. But what I find most interesting about her is in addition to all of that, she's also a very committed Christian. Recently, she gave a speech followed by a question and answer session that was covered by the New York Times, in which she tried to answer the question, how could somebody who's considered an intellectual leader at a place like MIT actually be a committed Christian? And by her own admission in this speech, she talked about at one point in her life, she was convinced that all religious people, are brainwashed. But then one of her friends challenged her to read the Bible for herself. She did, and not only did she read it, she started to investigate some of its claims. And the more she studied, the more she found that it started to make sense. In the question and answer session that followed her speech, somebody asked her about her belief in the resurrection. And here's what she said. She said, of course, someone might say, sure, you probably believe in little green men too. But the answer is an emphatic no. There's no evidence at all for little green men. There is, however, an abundance of historical evidence for the resurrection. Then she goes on and she talks about some of the reasons she believes Jesus really did come back from the dead. And then near the end of the evening, she made a comment that struck people as strange. She said, I just want you to know, even in a place like MIT, there are dozens of people, professors and students, some of the brightest minds in the world who all believe the same thing that I believe. So how do you explain that? Well, it goes back to the evidence. But it's not just the evidence. If you keep reading in John 20, there's something else you see. And on that second line, I want you to write this word. I want you to write the word accept. See, it's one thing to examine the evidence. It's something else to accept the conclusion. So Mary goes back to this tomb for the second time. She looks in. She encounters these angels. The angel says, why are you crying? Which seems like a dumb question to us. And then she says, hey, they've taken the Lord away, and I don't know where they put him. Now, at that point, she's still convinced that he's dead. In fact, one of the things that was true in the first century is that enemies would often dig up the bodies of their enemies who they defeated and bring those bodies back out and continue to desecrate them further. And that's what she's convinced is happening in Jesus. But then in verse 14, you see this dramatic moment where she turns around and everything is different. Verse 14. At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. But she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you're looking for? Thinking that he was the gardener. She said, sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will get him. You ever had an embarrassing moment, years later you kind of laugh about it, but in the moment it's not so funny? Can you imagine Mary telling this story to her grandkids, saying, you're not going to believe this. I went to the tomb, and I looked around, and there was Jesus, and I didn't know it was Jesus, and I thought that Jesus was the gardener, but it wasn't the gardener. Verse 16, Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. When you get to that third line, if you're keeping track, I want you to write the word believe. For Mary, this was the moment that she believed. The moment she heard Jesus say her name, everything suddenly made sense. This was not some random gardener. This was not some soldier. This was not some guy that just wandered in. This was Jesus, and somehow he had defeated death and come back from the dead. Now, I'm sure she couldn't explain how it happened. I'm sure she had some questions. That's a hard thing to believe then, just as it is now. But if you're like me, there's a part of you, and you read this story and think, that's really cool, but that's kind of hard to believe. But the truth is, you already believe a lot of things that are hard to believe. I want you to listen to what my friend Bob Russell wrote. He says this. He said, do you believe a small acorn can be planted in the ground to become a giant oak tree? Do you believe a tiny seed from a man can unite with the egg of a woman to form an almost invisible embryo from which will come a baby in 9 months, complete with ears, eyes, hands, feet, and an incredibly complex digestive system? If you've never witnessed the miracle of a birth or the growth of a tree, and if someone had just told you about them, you'd probably scoff and say, such things are impossible. Do you believe that Christians who have died will one day be raised with new, glorified, immortal bodies? If scientists can take a piece of dead tissue, extract the DNA, and clone an animal years after it's died, why is it so difficult to believe that the creator of that scientist can resurrect the dead? Then he concludes with this. We should believe in life after death because it's already been demonstrated. Jesus died, was buried, and is risen again. The truth is, all of life comes down to one question. Do you really believe that on that Friday afternoon, Jesus went to the cross, paid the penalty for your sin, was buried in a borrowed tomb, and then on Sunday morning, a little less than 72 hours later, he came back from the dead? That's the most important question that you'll ever be asked. That's the question that serves as the dividing line between life and death. When you get to verse 17, Jesus says something really significant. One of the things that's true in this story, that's interesting, is how different people react to the same evidence. So you have, in Matthew's telling the story, it says the soldiers wake up and they realize that something's happened, the tomb is empty, so they go to the chief priest. The chief priests say, hey, don't tell anybody, we're going to give you money, and you just tell everybody you fell asleep when somebody came and stole the body. That's the story they came up with. And it makes you ask the question, do you think it's possible to see all of the evidence for the resurrection and still refuse to believe? Of course it is. There's probably some people in this room, if I don't miss my guess, that's your story, man. You've heard this so many times, you could tell the story, and each time you hear it, there's a part of you that thinks, that makes pretty good sense, but there's also a part of you that thinks, if that's true, I'm going to have to give my life to it. And that's where a lot of us find the challenge. But if that's your situation, I want you to pay special attention to verse 17. Here's what Jesus said. Jesus said, do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Make sure you understand, the resurrection of Jesus is what opens the door for you to become a part of God's family. The moment you believe that, the moment you accept the evidence and you put your trust in that moment is when you move from God just being a God to being your God. You move from Him just being a Father that's out there and distant that you can't get to He actually becomes your Father. And the moment you put your trust in the story of the resurrection and in the person of Jesus coming back from the dead, that's the moment you move from God just being a God to being your God. And Mary understood that. And once she saw Jesus standing there, she knew that everything was different. Check out verse 18. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, I have seen the Lord. And she told them that He had said these things to her. On that last line in your outline, I want you to write the word share. You ever notice, like when you have good news, no matter what it is, you find a way to throw it in the conversation? I mean, it could be anything. Get money back on your taxes, your kid, makes the game winner or gets on the honor roll, or you win some, goofy drawing at your work, or you win one of those McDonald's Monopoly things. I mean, you'll throw whatever it is in a conversation. And yet for so many of us, we know this story so well. You've heard this story your entire life. You could take us through it person by person, event by event, and yet when it comes right down to it, you never share it with anybody. And you ask yourself, when's the last time you had a conversation about the resurrection? And for most of us, it's probably been too long. And the reason that's true is because most of us feel completely unqualified to tell anybody. You know you got junk in your life and you got skeletons in your closet, and we all do. So we're scared to death to say anything. But here's what I want to make sure you understand from this story. As you read the story of the resurrection, the very first person to ever share the message that Jesus had come back from the dead was Mary Magdalene. Think about that for a minute. The very first person to ever tell the story was a woman who just a couple years earlier had been demon-possessed by 7 demons who controlled her every move. I mean, if there's ever been anybody who should have been disqualified from sharing the story, it was Mary. And yet God chooses her to tell the world the greatest story that's ever been told, and it's a story that I'm pretty sure she told for the rest of her life. On that Sunday morning, as she got up very early in the morning and headed out to visit that tomb, Mary felt like her life was over. Everything that she'd been building was now gone. Nothing turned out as she hoped. The future was anything but promising. But then, once she arrived, everything was different. I have another picture I want to show you that you may have seen this week. One of the things that many people were worried about as they watched the Notre Dame Cathedral burn on Monday afternoon is, number one, would any of the complex survive, which it did? And number two, what would happen to the priceless works of art and the artifacts that were housed inside its walls? Would any of them survive? Well, after battling the fire for 12 hours, firefighters were able to finally get it under control. When they did, they walked into the main worship area, and somebody snapped this picture and released it to the media. If you look closely, you look this up online, you'll see later, you can see the smoke at the bottom there. You can see the charred destruction on some of the walls. And yet, rising above just all of that destruction is a cross that's untouched. And even more than that, the cross is a symbol of hope, but even more than that, it points us to an empty tomb. I don't know where you are this morning, but I know sometimes you turn on the television, sometimes you listen to what's happening around you, and man, it feels like the world is on fire. It feels like this whole deal is burning to the ground. You know, on Easter, people come to church for a lot of different reasons. Maybe you're here because you're here every Sunday, and that's what you do. It's a part of your life. Maybe you're here because you're here every Easter, and you didn't want to disappoint somebody in your family, or, you know, they promised to take you out to lunch or whatever. Or it could be there are a few of you here, and you're here today because deep inside, you may not admit this, but deep inside, it feels like your life is on fire. It feels like your life has been reduced to a pile of ashes. Maybe you're at a point in life where nothing has turned out like you thought it would. You're not who you thought you'd be. You're not where you thought you'd be. And it's not what you planned on. And if that's your situation, I want you to know that one experience with Jesus changes everything. I want you to stand. We're going to sing a song together as we close. And it's a song titled Come to the Altar. I really like the song, but in particular, I like the second verse. There's one line in this second verse that I want you to think about when we get there. And here's the way that the second verse reads. It says, leave behind your regrets and mistakes. Come today. There's no reason to wait. Jesus is calling. Bring your sorrows and trade them for joy. And then catch this line. From the ashes, a new life is born. Some of you are here, and you know what it's like to have your life burned to the ground. You know what it's like to feel like everything around you is now a pile of ashes. But I want you to know, if that's your situation, from those ashes, a new life can be born. It won't be because you're smarter than anybody. It won't be because you work harder. It won't be because of anything you do. It'll be totally dependent on Jesus. So if you're here this morning and you've never had an experience with Jesus, we want to invite you to do that. We've got everything you need. All you have to do is come and sit on this front row as we talk. Or maybe you're here and you say, I want to join the team at First Christian. Maybe you've been thinking about it, and today's the day. It could be a special day. And I know it's crowded, and I know it's hard to get out of your seat, but I promise you the people sitting around you, they'll move for you. If they don't move, I'll call the security team and we'll move them for you. You just do what you need to do as we sing.